Welcome everybody to our webinar on environmental racism. My name is Eugene Kung. I'm going to be your host this afternoon. I'm a staff lawyer at West Coast Environmental Law, and I am zooming in from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people in East Vancouver. I'm really excited to be able to host this conversation. We have some really amazing speakers coming up to talk about, a really topical issue, obviously something that's on people's minds right now, but it's a long-standing issue and something that I think hopefully we can help to connect some dots, give some tools and resources so that we can all move forward together in a better way. Because, we're talking in this moment a lot more about recognizing systemic racism, recognizing how it is part of almost every part of our society and structure. And I think that includes in particular the environmental sector as well. And so, in our own work of looking at our history, our past, and the ways that we've worked to achieve the goals that we're looking to, I think there is some really important introspection as well as sharing of some of those languages and learnings. I'm just going to take care of some housekeeping stuff for those who may not be familiar with Zoom platform. Some of us live here all the time, but for others it may be a new thing. So if you scroll and hover your mouse, if you're on a computer, down below the panel, you'll be able to see the chat button, as well as a Q&A button and participants, I believe. And so you will all be muted for the duration of this webinar, but you're welcome to chat, add questions and comments in the chat, and maybe we'll just start if you're able to just say hi in the chat, where you zooming in from, just so we get a sense of who's in the room. You will also, all right, just give me a second here. We'll also have Q&As and the ability to answer those. We'll have a period at the end where we'll be able to talk about some of the questions and answer some of those, but please feel free to add them throughout. And finally, this session is going to be recorded, and we'll be sharing a video following the webinar. And so just so you're aware of that. Before we get into it, I also just want to acknowledge and recognize the passing this morning of Chief Joe Gosnell, who's a Nisga'a chief, and just received word actually just as we were dialing in to start this webinar. And so thoughts with their family and community for that big loss. So I am really excited to pass the mic to four powerful women who have been working on these issues from different angles for some time. We're going to start with I'll just quickly introduce them in the order they're going to speak, and then I'll let them introduce themselves in more detail. But we're going to hear first from Lorene Oikawa. She is the president of the National Association of Japanese Canadians, also a board member at West Coast Environmental Law, and longtime supporter. So thank you, Lorene, for joining us. We're next going to go to Rihanna Seymour. Rihanna is West Coast's newest lawyer, having just joined the ranks of the legal profession officially after finishing her articles with us. Rihanna is an amazing activist and lawyer, Anishinaabe language and knowledge keeper, and she's going to share some of her thoughts and thinking. Following that, we have Chief Councillor Marilyn Slett from the Heiltsuk Nation. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with Chief Slett for many of her amazing work and initiatives, and she's always willing to speak publicly about all kinds of stuff and not shy away from uncomfortable truths. And I'm really looking forward to hearing some examples from from her community, and kind of connecting the dots from the other panelists. And then finally, we're going to hear from Sunshine Wiseman. Sunshine is a law student at West Coast Environmental Law. She has been working on a project to make our Access to Justice Environmental Legal Aid Fund more accessible to communities of color, and she's going to share a bit of that work with us. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it to Lorene.
Thank you so much, Eugene. I'm so excited to be here, and I'm thrilled to look at the chat box and see all the territories. As Eugene said, I'm with the National Association of Japanese Canadians. I'm a Yonsei, a fourth generation Japanese Canadian. I'm grateful to be living on the traditional non-ceded territories, of the Semiahmoo, Coquitlam, Kwantlen, Kinkai, and Tawasin First Nations, otherwise known as Surrey. And I'm speaking to you actually from my work in Langley, so I'd also like to acknowledge the Katsi and Matsqui First Nations. Racism. Racism is insidious. We're not born to hate. As children, we start to learn by observing within our circles, our family, our friends, our entertainment, our media. Racism takes many forms, from microaggressions to racial slurs, but it's also to policies and processes which limit opportunities for those who are not of the dominant white culture. So it's from the individuals to the groups of people. Indigenous peoples have been here for time immemorial, and European settlers started contact in the 1700s, and colonization began to change everything. The European settlers took over the land, the natural resources, trying to wipe out thousands of years of Indigenous culture. And this set in motion some of the patterns of discrimination which persist today. Don't have time to go into all of it, but the other thing want to dispel, we were known as the haven for Black Americans escaping through the Underground Railway, but don't be complacent, because slavery existed in Canada as well. There were Indigenous slaves, also Black people, and the slavery was based on race, that people weren't people, they were property. Then another form of slavery occurred, which was indentured servitude. So racialized settlers came to Canada, and they were dominated by the white culture that decided that they were lesser and not deserving of the same pay or respect or rights. So for example, having legal status as citizens, be able to have a say, be able to vote. One of my personal examples from the Oikawa side of the family, they came in 1906. My mom's side came in the 1800s, both from Japan, and they kept a journal. And it was interesting because when they arrived by ship in 1906, I won't go into the whole long story, but they owed money. There were some debts, there were some fines. And so the first thing they did was they worked for the railway. And I'm reading this journal, and it's amazing how they actually managed to move from that, because they needed food, they needed clothing, they needed equipment. And guess where they got all of that? From the company store. So they owed money to the employer from the start. They did manage to pay off their debts, and they were able to get back to Vancouver, and they settled on an island in the Fraser River, the Oikawa Island it was known as, before the Second World War, and they were fishing and boat building. So a little bit of my story, but there were other Japanese Canadians, there were other racialized settlers. For Japanese Canadian community though, in 1942, it didn't matter how long they were here or what work they did or how they were good citizens, they became enemy aliens according to the dominant white culture again. And about 22,000 of them from the West Coast were forcibly uprooted, dispossessed, and interned. And the government used the law against them. They used an act, the War Measures Act, to take this action. And the dispossession included taking all of their property, businesses, fishing boats, vehicles, everything. So flash forward 1988, the Japanese Canadian community got an apology. Never again. But the problem is racism isn't erased with an apology. And part of the bigger problem is that people, they don't know history or they've forgotten stories. And particularly for Indigenous and racialized stories, we're left out of the historical narrative of Canada. So the discrimination and systemic racism continues. And we see it embedded in all different areas. It's in terms of employment. When you look at who has what employment, we see it in education, who has access to education, who graduates, who gets on to higher education. We see it in the criminal justice system, disproportionate representation, Indigenous people, Black people. We see it in food systems, who has access to the quality food. We see it in healthcare, and even recently we've seen racism, Indigenous people being made fun of by health folks. We see it in housing, the types of housing that, again, disproportionately represented by racialized people, Indigenous people, and also where they live. So in terms of the location, where the population is, where industry is, industrial contaminants. And it's not just tied to socioeconomic status as well. It's tied into some of the processes, discrimination through housing, discrimination through the planning processes. And yes, even with environmentalism, mainstream environmental organizations, we have to take a hard look at ourselves as well. There hasn't been as much looking at the impact on communities of color. And not just with environmental organizations, other organizations, institutions, government. There's a lack of representation at the highest levels of decision making. Racialized Indigenous people not having a voice, or if we speak up, we're dismissed or ignored. And I think one of the things of my pet peeves too is that sometimes there's a focus on the things that we should be doing for the future, for future generations. But in a way, it's also a cop-out because it's making it seem like it's far off and we don't have to do anything. But climate change is now. It's something we need to do now. And communities are impacted, are suffering, and again, disproportionately racialized communities, Indigenous communities. So one of the things is about just transition being part of the plan, because people don't always have choices. So disproportionately Black, Indigenous, people of color in jobs and industries which maybe aren't good for the environment, but they have to look after their families. They need to put food on the table. So we need to think of ways that there can be a transition so families aren't suffering, that people recognize that people with less means have less choice, but also recognizing that sometimes they're the ones with less of a footprint. They take transit, they recycle, they're buying local, but they're also in those, as I mentioned, the housing, those areas with pollution, or just recently the heat wave. So suffering with that heat wave and thinking, oh, if only I had air conditioning. And those with means, they have air conditioning, or they can buy their way out of it. They leave, they don't have to worry about the problem. And one last thought that I want to leave you with is about privilege, because I know sometimes some folks don't understand about privilege. And I'll hear people say, well, I never had it easy. My family never had it easy. But it's not about money. It's not saying that you had it easier. What it's saying is that you may have had challenges, but your challenges weren't about your ethnicity, about race. When you're not racialized, you're not Indigenous, you're accepted more into mainstream society. When you're racialized or Indigenous, there's a lot of, as I mentioned, some of the microaggressions or the questions you hear all the time. And I know sometimes when I've talked to my friends, they're always a bit surprised. So one of the things, well, not surprised so much now, but one of the things that I shared with them was, I'm a fourth generation Canadian, but the question I often get is, oh, where are you from? And I'll say Surrey. And then the follow-up question is, but where are you really from? So again, this othering of not being accepted, of not being thought of as being from here. And that we hear all the time. And so it's this unfortunate shared experience with racialized folks and Indigenous. And it's not in the past, it's also present. And for example, COVID-19 with the pandemic, we've seen an increase in hate, in anti-Asian hate. And that's one thing my organization, the National Association of Japanese Canadians, and other organizations we're working with, we're working on this. And so as allies, please support that work as well that organizations are doing. And you'll see that in the resources that West Coast is going to provide for you, a lot of great resource information. But I do want to thank you for being here because you want to make a difference, and we all can make a difference. And this is one step of it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lorene, for setting out that context. And of course, you know, when we talk about systemic racism, when we talk about the founding ideologies of white supremacy, the point is that these are across the board and built into our systems and structures. And that includes, as we're going to focus on for the rest of our time here, environmental issues, but also how we even think about environmental issues. You know, I was on a similar panel about a month ago, and a young Black environmental studies scholar named áwázitų she was talking about how environmental stressors in the built environment are also have a disproportionate impact, and in that case was talking about, for example, statues of slave owners or colonizers. You know, so you're supposed to be able to go to a park and relax, but you've got some guy standing there like this pointing, and that actually is is an additional cause of environmental stressor that perhaps mainstream conservation environmentalism wouldn't even really consider as within the purview of that issue. But of course, those do have longer term impacts and go across the board. I'm going to pass it next to Rihanna, who is going to talk a little bit about what environmental racism is, and I think get ready to join the chat because there's going to be a couple of prompts and questions. Rihanna.
Bonjour, my Indigenous Jean Kutuk Indigenous cause ma kwandu them neon gashing and dunji. My English name is Rihanna Seymour, and I'm a Anishinaabe from Treaty 3 territory, which is in northwestern Ontario and part of Manitoba. My clan is Bear, and my community is called Big Island. Right now I'm calling from Treaty 3 territory. We're actually going to be starting to make our way back to Vancouver this week. But yeah, I just wanted to kind of set the tone of like, to set the tone and the grounding for the next panelists to share their experiences and examples. But first I wanted to kind of bring your voices into the Zoom. So if you can go to the next slide, and I'm wondering if you can just in the chat add in what is environmental racism, a few words or a sentence or whatever. So I'll just wait for a few seconds until answers start coming in. Yeah, there's some things coming up: gentrification, access to lands, placements of pollutions, yet focusing on a particular group or community. So as we see, there's like no shortage of examples of environmental racism. We all know of examples of environmental racism. But like an example of a definition is a type of discrimination where people of low income minority communities are forced to live in close proximity or environmentally hazardous or degraded environments such as toxic waste pollution and urban decay. So thank you so much for that. The next question that I'm going to ask is, what is environmental justice? Reconciliation, the right to clean air. I don't know, it's fine. Yeah, true inclusion. So it looks from the answers that a lot of people have an understanding of what environmental justice means, but one definition is it embraces the principle that all people and communities are entitled to equal protection of environmental and public health laws and regulation. So there's still examples coming in, and we're gonna be doing a picture at the end to show the answers. So those are to kind of keep us grounded. That's what environmental racism is, and then that's what environmental justice is. And just to kind of get more deeper into those issues, I got these diagrams from Instagram. I'm finding that there's so much tools to learn from, and images and access to different BIPOC voices on these issues on Instagram and the different pages that I follow. So I would recommend, if you wanted to kind of diversify your news feed, Instagram is like a really great way to do that. But just to drop some statistics. So in urban areas, 25% of the lowest socioeconomic status neighborhoods are within 1 kilometer of a major polluting industrial facility, when it's 7% for the wealthiest. And one particular example of environmental racism in Canada is Chemical Valley. So it's by Sarnia and Aamjiwnaang First Nation in Ontario. And 40% of the Chemical Valley are a few kilometers away from, you know, that small town and that First Nation of Aamjiwnaang. There are so many examples, but a few is like the mercury poisoning and contamination of a paper mill in Grassy Narrows, and which is in Ontario, my territory. And I've heard from people themselves, elders, young people, of the impacts that mercury poisoning has on their bodies and yeah, their families. So it's still continuing. They're still fighting for justice and have been since the 60s. Nova Scotia in Shelburne, water wells are contaminated by an old dump site, and it's the Black community that are suffering from high cancer rates that is near in Nova Scotia. Like I talked about, Chemical Valley near Sarnia, Ontario, and yeah, the local First Nations are really at risk from all of those chemicals. I remember being in undergrad and learning about Chemical Valley, and there's this little boy who drew a picture of his territory, and it was just a chemical plant. So it's like kids are playing in their backgrounds and that's what they see, right? And as like a lot of us know, the Inuit have been greatly impacted by climate change and have been warning us for years and years, and they're being the first that are affected by the warming climates. So those are some examples within Canada, but then what's really important to recognize is that environmental racism is global and it connects us all to each other. So Lorene brought up an example the other day of the Hiroshima nuclear bomb, and it was actually Canada that provided their uranium, and it was the Dene peoples who mined it, and they didn't wear any protection. They didn't really know that they were handling a hazardous waste, and many of them were exposed to cancer, and cancer rates are still high. And I thought about this story that my uncle Fred Kelly told me about. So he's traveled a lot, and he talked about going to Hiroshima, where the bomb like where it happened, and he did a pipe ceremony to pay homage to, you know, all of those people who were lost, and also taking responsibility because that uranium was mined from Turtle Island, right? So he had nothing to do with it, but he was recognizing his role from just simply being born here and being like, there's a responsibility to do something and I can do something. So he did a pipe ceremony to honor that over there, which I thought was really beautiful. But you can see like that it, you know, environmental racism is global, and it affects multiple groups, even at one point in time. And yeah, those are just some examples. So environmental racism is very multifaceted, and Lorene talked a little bit about those microaggressions that play into environmental racism and justify the treatment of those behaviors. So even just little like comments weigh into environmental racism right up until like the law is created and enforced on the ground. So there's a massive spectrum, but there's also, yeah, it's very layered. And if you can go to the next slide. So moving towards environmental justice, I like to think of it as how I look at the world and how I do my work, and recognizing what's missing and how I might fill in those gaps, which is essential. So I started, really thinking about environmentalism as intersectional, like it's necessary. So like, how does gender play a role in this, and health and race and socioeconomic status? How does it play into all of these issues and examples of environmental racism to provide, like, that's who we need to really listen to learn about how to get to move towards environmental justice. So if there's one thing that I would want everybody to leave with, is it's that we need to provide space, opportunity to hear from voices that are most affected, because I'm quite certain that the people that are facing these issues have been facing them for decades and know exactly what needs to be done and how it can be done, right? And just needs that capacity and that space. So nothing new has to be invented. Everything's already there. So I like to think of it as like, how am I showing up at work every day, and how am I learning and unlearning? So one big example that I've been learning and unlearning is the intersectionality of just being Indigenous. So making more space and learning from Afro-Indigenous peoples, and creating those learning opportunities, and just continuing with my own learning journey, because it's ongoing and it doesn't end. And we see how this is kind of happening in Canada too, like looking at environmental justice and social justice and all of these intersectional ways of freedom, basically. And we can see what's missing and what needs to be done. So for example, I'll just give a few more examples and then I'm gonna pass it on. But the Canadian Environmental Protection Act is Canada's main pollution prevention law, and it does not mention environmental justice, human rights, or vulnerable populations. But just recently this year, the Supreme Court of Canada just opened up a doorway into a path to hold Canadian corporations civilly liable for violations of international human rights law. Because as I mentioned, how it's so global, there's Canadian companies in international territories that are perpetuating human rights violations against, you know, peoples who are often BIPOC and BIPOC communities. So there's starting to be some opening in Canada. And then also MP Lenore Zan introduced the National Strategy to Redress Environmental Racism Act. So this bill would require environmental ministers to examine the link between race, socioeconomic status, and environmental risks, and develop a strategy to redress that. So it's still in the beginning stages, but we're beginning to see like what is possible with looking at these issues in an intersectional way, and recognizing that these issues are inherently part of the problems we are trying to solve, such as racism, environmental degradation, you know, like all of these things, they're all interconnected, intertwined, and that's part of the path towards moving towards environmental justice, is recognizing that and seeing what we can do as individuals within ourselves, but also within our families, communities, and workspaces. So that's all I'll say for now. Miigwech.
Thank you so much, Rihanna, for that great overview and for reminding us that this starts on a personal level with how we interact with each other and how we, relate to power and privilege, both with what we hold and also in relation to others, but that it spans all the way to the global, whether it's Canadian mining companies operating in other countries, or folks maybe remember the controversy from a few years ago where a bunch of Canadian garbage was sent to the Philippines, right, and just kind of out of sight, out of mind from a Canadian perspective, but of course for the end destination in the Philippines, obviously it was a bigger problem, and in that case actually was sent back. And they refused to receive it, but I think it shows, the part of this pattern. And of course, climate change on a global scale is a huge example of environmental racism, and where an environmental justice lens is critical, right? And you have the people who are the least responsible for the problem, who have the least ability to adapt and mitigate the change, who are the most impacted. And we've already seen that on a global scale, in Pacific Islands and other global South communities impacted by climate change and sea level rise. But there are also, I think it also plays into the way that we think about climate change. And, in particular, I was thinking of the example where, often when we talk about different countries' emissions and the different ways you can look at it, Canada is among the top in the world per capita, but because we have a relatively smaller population, it's maybe a smaller absolute number. And then often people point at places like India and China, right? And what I always get frustrated about during those conversations, because it's important to track and count these if we're going to solve the problems, but most of those emissions in China, for example, are essentially have been offloaded from the countries who are consuming those products that are being manufactured there, right? So you have cheaper labor and maybe lower environmental standards, but those emissions, those emissions are caused by producing goods that are consumed, that are meant for primarily the Western, North America or European economies, where they don't then have to count those emissions in terms of the manufacturing. So there's lots of ways that it shows up on a personal, on a global scale. We're going to hear a little bit more of some examples on a regional scale from Chief Slett from Heiltsuk. Over to you. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is áwázitų Marilyn Slett, and I'm the Chief Councillor for the Heiltsuk Tribal Council and a member of the Heiltsuk Nation. And we're located on the central coast of British Columbia. I wanted to start before I wanted to thank Rihanna for her presentation and the words by the moderator and the context given for today. I'm really pleased to be here today and share our experience, but also to give voice with the really good people that have dialed in and the people that are helping to bring these issues out into mainstream and out into the forefront. Before I get started, I wanted to share a quote, a couple of quotes. The first one is the hard work that Indigenous people have been doing for decades and decades is coming to a head. We must change the fundamental relationship. We must ensure Indigenous sovereignty before we lose this opportunity forever. And that was Arthur Manuel. And I share that, and it also heartens, me to see the people and the young people with, great Indigenous minds out there that are sharing and making sure that everything that we do is not just for the future, but for the here and now, making sure that we're doing everything that we can to protect what we have. The other is from, this is from a statement that was made at the Royal Commission on Indian Affairs in 1913 here in Heiltsuk territory, and it was by one of our HEMAs. And this statement is, I'll only read part of it, but it grounds Heiltsuk in everything that we do and in the work that we're doing. And this whole transcript of this commission that happened here has also been enacted by students in our high school here in Bella Bella, by our young people. So this is Bob Anderson to the Royal Commission in 1913. We feel we own the whole of this country, every bit of it, and we ought to have something to say about it. We own it all. We will never change our mind in that respect, and after we are dead, our children will hold the same ideas. It does not matter how long the government takes to determine this question. We will remain the same in our ideas about this matter. We consider that the government is stealing the land from us, and we also understand that it is unlawful for the government to take this. So that is a statement from, like I said, Bob Anderson. He was a Heiltsuk leader, and he made that statement to the commission. And I thought it was, for us, that statement is reflective of the Heiltsuk mindset, and it's reflective of how we conduct ourselves, in terms of protecting what we have, and also putting forward our Heiltsuk sovereignty into this contemporary world that we're living in. So I wanted to speak a bit today, and I want to thank West Coast Environmental Law for asking me to be a part of today's panel. I'm really honored to be here with all of you, and feels a little bit strange sometimes talking into our computer in this virtual world, but I hope that what we're sharing today does resonate with people, and we can help to expand, this voice, and expand, the injustice that, is really prevalent in the environmental world. So we can move to the next slide. One form of environmental racism for Indigenous peoples, it includes laws that refuse to recognize the deep relationship of Indigenous peoples with our environment, the lands, the waters, and the living things in our territories. It arises from government actions. It includes the making of laws that result in layers of direct and indirect discrimination against Indigenous peoples. We have, such a intertwined relationship with the environment, and for us, it's just a way of life. It's in our thoughts. But the laws that are created, in mainstream Canada, discriminate because of all parts of that, you know, it affects our lands, it affects our waters, it affects the living things within our territories. And these are all essential parts of our identity, which, you know, Canadian law does not respect. Next slide. This photo here is, that was taken in October at the opening of our big house here in Bella Bella. And that was the, this is the first big house that has been built in our current village of Bella Bella in over 120 years. So it was a big celebration within our community, but the big house represents our Gwe laws. It represents how we conduct ourselves as Heiltsuk people. So everything that we do is public. It's in the big house. It's guided by our Heiltsuk Himas, our hereditary chiefs, by our umakses, our ladies of high ranking, our community, our children. And this big house is just wonderful to have in our community. We celebrated potlatch for 5 days when we opened the big house, and shortly thereafter, here we are in a COVID environment, and it's been really hard on our people, you know, but we do adapt, and you know, we are doing everything that we can to make sure that when we gather again in that big house, that nobody is left behind. So our traditional territories lie on what is now called the Central Coast of British Columbia, and it covers more than 16,000 square kilometers of land, and it also extends to the nearshore and offshore waters, and you know, it covers that submerged land as well. Next slide. So the Crown's denial over Heiltsuk laws and identity in our territory. So since before first contact with Europeans, Heiltsuk has exercised sovereignty over Heiltsuk territory, and we applied our own system of laws. Heiltsuk has occupied and controlled and managed and harvested from Heiltsuk territory pursuant to our laws, known as Heiltsuk Gwe laws. And, you know, for us, it's, you know, around the principles of sustainability, the principles of respect for the land. It's sustained us for thousands and thousands of years. The principles of take a little, leave a lot. And, you know, the reliance that we have on our traditional territory can't be underscored. My late uncle Cisco used to say, when the tide goes out, the table is set. You know, we are marine people, and we rely on a healthy ocean, you know, to remain healthy Heiltsuk. So Gwe laws derives from Lakve, which refers to our inherent authority of place and ownership. And that, you know, flows through our hereditary leaders. They are, you know, the holders of our traditional governance. And they are the reason why we are here today. Their guidance and their inherent, you know, the grooming of being a chief, you know, going through the generations and leaders of our tribes. So, you know, for us, you know, it's really important. I'm an elected leader. I'm a member of our nation, you know, elected by the community. But, you know, as elected leaders, we know that the traditional governance of the Heiltsuk is the true governance of the Heiltsuk. And we support our hereditary leaders in our community. And through our elected positions, you know, that's, you know, our role is to support our community and to support our hereditary chiefs and our elders as they provide the guidance. So our Gwelas expresses our spiritual values, our principles, our beliefs, and about our ways of being. Our Gwelas governs the relationship that we have with the natural and the spiritual world. It governs our responsibility to our resources, including our lands, our waters, and our living beings within Heiltsuk territory. Sorry, I've got some notes here so I don't drift off into some space that I shouldn't. Heiltsuk territory is not just a resource for Heiltsuk, it is, we're one, our existence is, through our culture, through our language, through our stories, through our governance, through a healthy ocean, through healthy lands. And that has been, what has provided the foundation for us to be here through, the thousands of years that we have been. The interdependence of families and peoples and all living things in the natural state is how we maintain our balance and the harmony with those relationships. Heiltsuk territory includes lands that are sacred to Heiltsuk, including lands that form part of our origin stories for our tribes. We're an amalgamation of tribes that make up Heiltsuk. Since the time of contact with Europeans, and since the time of Imperial Crown's assertion of sovereignty over British Columbia, the Crown has denied Heiltsuk's relationship with the environment within Heiltsuk territory. And, we can go on to, their legally defining property and sovereignty, through their lens as the Crown. We have long, and they have long refused, to acknowledge Heiltsuk's sovereignty and ownership over our territory. And more recently, the courts have, recognized the concepts of Aboriginal title and self-government, but the Crown will not recognize Aboriginal ownership until Heiltsuk proves this through expensive court proceedings. The Crown will not recognize Aboriginal sovereignty until a final agreement, is sought that settles all issues. Until then, Heiltsuk territory is legally presumed to be Crown land belonging to either British Columbia or Canada, or in the case of water and water, land covered in water, for which no court or government has recognized the possibility of Aboriginal title. And, I shared with you at the beginning of the presentation here today our thoughts around that and how we guide ourselves as Heiltsuk people. So despite lacking Crown recognized ownership of lawmaking powers, Heiltsuk's way of life and our relationship with our territory continues, and it's strong. We are, a community that, has, since the time of the lifting of the prohibition of, our culture with the potlatch ban, our community has been working so hard with the resurgence of our culture, the resurgence of our language, the resurgence of Heiltsuk sovereignty. We harvest with respect to the lands and waters, and we also protect them. We live by our laws, despite colonial attempts to overwrite them. We also live with Canadian laws that protect or fail to protect, the environment from human activities, which, were made without our engagement and without our consent. They exclude our reality and our interconnectedness with the environment. On a daily basis, we experience these laws which separate the environment from our identity. Next slide. So you can see with this photo, the Nathan E. Stewart, and I wanted to share, just briefly with you some of our experience with this. In October 2016, the Nathan E. Stewart tug barge ran aground and spilled oil into a major Heiltsuk harvesting area. It was also one of our, and is one of our Heiltsuk ancient village sites. And our struggle to seek justice under Canadian law is a poignant example of the type of environmental racism embedded in such laws. You know, to date, there has been no environmental impact assessment. You know, we can also use the bitumen reference case as another case decision by Canada failing to recognize the role of Indigenous peoples and the role that we have in protecting our environment. So you can see this is the Nathan E. Stewart tug as it was sinking. And you can see, you know, the boom on the beach there. You know, this was a devastating time for our community. We have not been able to harvest, you know, in this area since the spill. And, you know, our people used to harvest up to 25 species, you know, in Gale Pass, Gale Creek. And it's been a struggle, you know, to seek justice and to make sure that those responsible for this are held accountable. Next slide. Another example is the Marine Liability Act. And this is another act, you know, that has been in place and, you know, without consultation with Indigenous peoples. It provides for no coverage of cultural losses caused by things like the incidents like the Nathan E. Stewart. You know, our losses are, you know, certainly, you know, you can see and know that it would be the harvesting losses that we have, but you know, the site was also, you know, one of our village sites, one of our major village sites. So, you know, for us, it's being able to go out there and practice, you know, our ceremony and practice who we are as Heiltsuk people. So, you know, the damage and the impact is great. And, you know, examples of the Marine Liability Act, they don't cover those types of, you know, losses. And, you know, that's something that really needs to be addressed. So for us, you know, and Indigenous peoples generally, the impacts of an oil spill will most always include cultural losses that are beyond, you know, harvesting for food. Next slide. I don't know how much time I have left. Just give me the signal.
You're doing great.
Okay, thanks. So another example is the BC Environmental Management Act and Canada's Shipping Act. And, you know, we use the Nathan E. Stewart, you know, as it has interlinked with this. So while both acts empower government to order a polluter to compensate for the expense of an environmental impact act, in Heiltsuk's case, neither government has made such an order. The governments have continued to decline approving the environmental impact assessment that is Indigenous led. For Heiltsuk, and we expect for all Indigenous generally, a Western-based environmental impact assessment would be inadequate. It wouldn't cover those things that I just, you know, mentioned earlier. And it's designed not to capture Indigenous losses and to apply, you know, to Indigenous concepts of loss. So notably, we find Canada and BC's, you know, position on this ironic, given the advent of Indigenous-led impact assessments under BC and Canadian Environmental Assessment Act post-project, you know, in the project planning phase, but not with an incident such as the Nathan E. Stewart. Next slide. So aside from the challenges, you know, posed by laws made without us, no single court can address rights and title issues that intersect with ship source ocean oil spills in challenging environmental laws based on asserting our Aboriginal title. So, you know, we've been harvesting and managing, we have these rights. They've been split into 2 courts and 1 tribunal. 1 court over the jurisdiction over Aboriginal title, 1 court over ship stores, ocean oil spills, and the tribunal addresses compensation. So it's really complex. It's not very effective, it's expensive, and it provides for barriers for communities like mine to make sure that we're doing everything that we can to make sure that companies, you know, and polluters that, you know, have these types of spills in our oceans are held accountable. Yet we are the ones that, you know, bear the risk. We are the ones that, you know, continue to live with the impacts. We're also the ones that will be out there when there is an incident. Our people were out there on daybreak, you know, with the grounding of the Nathan E. Stewart, and they were out there trying to, you know, do what they can to make sure that, you know, we can, you know, protect what we have. So, you know, it's you know, those types of issues that we continue to live in. Next slide. So we're also in this era of UNDRIP and DRIPA. And, you know, in summary, you know, these impacts, you know, and I hope I did okay with illustrating, you know, some of the layers and, you know, the direct and indirect discrimination against, you know, my community, you know, and how they interact with the Canadian environmental laws. So, you know, we have DRIPA and UNDRIP, and, you know, we know that there's this promise, you know, more recently with DRIPA, BC and Canada will work with the human rights principles embodied within UNDRIP. However, the fulfillment of this promise requires that the principles be implemented at every stage of government and judicial decision making. And, you know, there's a lot of work to do, and, you know, that work has to start, and they have to work with our communities as we, you know, make this a reality. Otherwise, it's going to continue with that top down. This means governments must create, amend, and apply statutory and common laws so that they align with, you know, our laws. And, you know, they also uphold things like our principles that we undertake to protect and steward our territories. This is yet to take root, and there's a lot of work that needs to be done within BC and Canada to begin removing the layers of the environmental racism embodied in the colonial environmental laws. You know, in closing, you know, we have, you know, we're Heiltsuk territory is also, you know, part of what people, you know, refer to or know, you know, parts of our territories from the Central Coast up to Haida Gwaii as the Great Bear Rainforest. And we did a lot of work to protect, you know, the forest and make sure that this part of the world can be enjoyed by everyone. But there's still, you know, major contamination sites. You know, Namu is one of them. It was an industrial town, industrial in terms of, you know, fish processing from the early 1900s to the 1970s. And it was left, you know, kind of, you know, fishing, you know, was no longer making money. You know, the fish were on a decline, and, you know, the companies up and left, and we have buildings dilapidating, filled with asbestos falling into the ocean, fuel farms and tanks, you know, polluting the water. And, you know, things like this, you know, it shouldn't be allowed to happen. These are, Namu is one of our major, it's one of the most recorded archaeological sites in British Columbia. And it's home of one of our tribes, and we can carbon date back 10,000 years in Namu alone. So, you know, there's a lot of work to do. There's a lot of examples around environmental racism. And I want to thank you for listening, and áwázitë. It heartens me to be a part of this panel, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Chief Slett, for that really powerful presentation and really clear examples of how the current law completely fails to address the concerns even after a major spill. And thank you for sharing. I know that you know, I've heard you speak about Nathan E. Stewart a number of times, and I just want to acknowledge that it was a traumatic event, and that retelling that has the impact of re-traumatizing. And so thank you for sharing and for being honest with us about that, and for really bringing that example to a really clear point. And I think it really shows and demonstrates that you know, the change that's needed is not marginal around the edges, you know, an amendment here or there. It's really structural, and some of the work that Heiltsuk is leading on in not just looking to change Canadian law, but asserting Heiltsuk's own laws is something that I really take a lot of inspiration from. And I'd be remiss not to mention, of course, that that's a big part of the work that West Coast is engaged in and involved in, and has been for decades, of revitalizing Indigenous laws and applying them to contemporary environmental issues. Rihanna is also on the team, and we have a great team of lawyers who are trained in Canadian law, but also learning and facilitating the revitalization of Indigenous laws, which will have the impact of improving decisions. And, you know, if we can get those embedded into Canadian law, I think would result in drastically different types of decisions coming out of the existing regimes. And that ultimately is, you know, a fundamental part of West Coast's mission to transform the legal landscape and to include and embed Indigenous laws into Canadian decision-making. Our next speaker is Sunshine Wiseman. She's going to speak a little bit about some of the work she's done in looking at West Coast's Environmental Dispute Resolution Fund, environmental legal aid, as we sometimes call it, and ensuring that it is more accessible to communities of color and Indigenous communities. So over to you, Sunshine. Thanks.
Thank you, and Vinaka Vakalevu for including me in this important conversation. And thank you to the other panelists for sharing your wisdom and experiences and knowledge. And thanks for everyone who dialed into this call. I want to start by acknowledging that I'm calling in from East Vancouver on the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. So my name is Sunshine. I'm working as a summer law student at West Coast. And my background is that I'm half Black, Jewish, part Nepalese, and Indigenous from Fiji. And I come from the Shark clan, the Neo and Snake clan, Dendikuladi. And so personally, as a Black and Indigenous person from the South Pacific, the issue of environmental justice and racism are very close to my heart. My mother raised me with stories about how she saw firsthand the environmental degradation of her village in Fiji, to the point that in a lot of ways it's become unrecognizable in just a few generations. And I'm really grateful that I get to be part of this work at West Coast to help protect the environment on Coast Salish territory, and while acknowledging and working to dismantle environmental racism in ways that are within our power. So this summer, I'm lucky enough that I get to work on a really exciting project that aims to make sure that our access to justice programs embody our commitment to environmental justice to the greatest extent possible. And so for context, we have two programs within our access to justice heading. And one of them is the legal advice program. So we help people in BC to protect the places where they live, work, and play. And if they have legal questions related to an environmental problem, our team can help find answers. And every year, our staff lawyers provide hundreds of hours of legal information and advice to Indigenous peoples, individuals, or advocacy groups facing environmental justice and health problems in BC. So we just help people understand their legal options to better protect the health of their environment and communities. And then the second program is the Environmental Dispute Resolution Fund, or the EDRF, and it provides grants to British Columbians who have organized to protect their communities and environment and who need legal help. And so funds allow folks to hire lawyers and experts at reduced rates and work collaboratively with them to resolve disputes. Might be negotiations or mediation or in court or before government tribunals. And we distribute $150,000 in grants every year. And so through the project that I'm working on, we're taking a hard look at the practices of those two programs through an environmental justice lens. And as it's already been brilliantly discussed in this webinar, we recognize that racialized and Indigenous communities and other historically marginalized groups are often disproportionately impacted by pollution and unsustainable development. And our intention with this project is to establish how folks who are disproportionately impacted can engage and benefit from these programs as best as possible. So the three main questions I've been working to answer this summer are: how do we identify those with priority needs? How do we identify what barriers there might be to accessing our services? And how do we generate options for solutions? So what I've been up to is conducting interviews with folks who serve our priority communities in various capacities, particularly listening to the voices of people who are part of those communities in order to deepen our understanding of the challenges and options for solutions and best practices that we can implement to make our legal help programs as accessible as possible. So from those conversations and interviews, I've analyzed some of the suggestions offered, and I'm in the process of creating a report of recommendations that I'll be presenting to an internal group at the end of the summer. And then from there, we'll determine what concrete actions we are going to take to improve our program's accessibility. So to give you a preview of some of the potential barriers that have been identified generally with regards to accessing legal help for environmental issues, I'll share a few with you all. I've come across many, but I've narrowed it down to 3 in the interest of time. So one that's come up is that some communities may not feel safe engaging with the justice system, especially Black and Indigenous communities, and for very good reason, as has come to the forefront of society's awareness in recent times with the existence of excessive structural violence and injustice against racialized folks in the justice system. There's a lot of valid reasons to lack trust. And while this discomfort particularly applies to relationships with police, there still may be discomfort about trusting a lawyer who may be perceived as being a representative of the same system. So it's an interesting example of something that we're aware of and trying to grapple with. And so having an intersectional lens when looking at environmental justice and racism highlights that not only are these environmental harms concentrated in racialized and marginalized communities, but also that even the solutions that exist can have inherent barriers that are kind of shrouded by privilege and systemic issues of racial inequality and injustice. And it takes active work to dismantle those barriers that exist and to access those supports. So there certainly aren't easy answers, and these are big questions, but some of the possible options and solutions I've come across are: one, to hire and recruit more diverse lawyers. For example, to help clients feel more comfortable and see themselves reflected in the justice system is really important. Another one is having lawyers do their homework and research before meeting with clients. This is hopefully and probably common practice already, but just being able to understand the context of the environmental issue and then being able to openly listen and learn about how those environmental issues are interconnected to other aspects of communities. And then another one is a transparent lawyering approach. So making it clear about the inherent limitations or issues that exist in the legal system that affect BIPOC folks, and just being honest to build trust and acknowledging that folks are completely justified to not trust the system. And we're not trying to sell anyone on that, but how can we work together for the law to be used in a strategic way? So that's the first barrier that I'll talk about. And then the second one that's come up is, for example, our reliance on written and phone communication at all stages of the process, particularly the application stage. This also engages aspects of privilege. For example, internet access or literacy or familiarity with the law and bureaucratic forms. So we're asking ourselves questions like, what are some creative solutions to make our application process more accessible for individuals who might not be as comfortable with writing, for example, or might not have access. And so things that we've done in the past is accept applications in the form of voice notes, or for folks who weren't able to get access to a computer, they've been able to phone and then dictate the information for their form. But we're looking towards the future and to make this possibly a more established practice and to come up with guidelines for accepting voice notes or phone applications. And then my third barrier that I'll discuss is the perceived expectation in the application process that applicants should frame their lived experiences as an environmental law issue. So through environmental justice, we acknowledge the interconnectedness of environmental issues to many other aspects of life for many communities, for example, the environment and human rights. And so we're looking at if there's ways to tailor our application process to acknowledge this interconnectedness and to ensure that our understanding of what constitutes a climate issue or an ecological harm is broadening and evolving as we come across more people with a range of experiences. Particularly because communities of color and Indigenous communities may approach environmental problems using different language than what the law sets out. So we just want to ensure that we're constantly learning and increasing our competency to be able to listen better. So some of the suggestions for this that we've received are that it's important to approach this without undermining the agency of the applicant to frame their own truth and their own issues, and we can help bring out the intersection of their goals with environmental objectives, but without speaking for them, without making assumptions, and just to take a co-learning approach and build relationships that support mutual understanding. So those are some of the things that have come up in my research this summer. I'm really happy to be working on this project. And yeah, these are just a few examples of the kind of thought processes that we're investing in to ensure that our environmental justice work is tangibly accessible to folks that we recognize are most impacted by environmental issues. And we're committed to a continuous learning process and to growing our understanding of the diverse needs of folks in BC and to evolving and improving our abilities to support and address those concerns. And so I have a call to action to everybody before I finish. It's just, if any of you watching have a concern in your life that relates to the environment in BC, I strongly encourage you to reach out to us. Our legal advice program or our legal aid program is a great place to start, and you can call or email us, and I'll likely be the one to answer during the summer. And we'll be able to chat about your environmental concern, and then I'll discuss the situation with our staff legal aid lawyer, Dr. Larry Reynolds, and we'll work to help you understand the law and the legal options you have to address your environmental issue. And we'll be able to refer you to other resources, or if there's an immediate environmental benefit, our lawyers can write a letter or make a telephone call to a government decision maker. But either way, we can help determine what options you have. And then after our chat, if we think that your issue might require more than basic legal advice, we may encourage you to apply to our Environmental Dispute Resolution Fund. And as I mentioned before, this provides grants to British Columbians who have organized to protect their communities. And so if you'd like to talk to a lawyer about a BC-focused environmental law problem, but you're not sure if you're ready to apply to the fund, you can contact Barb Everdeen, and she's our EDRF project manager, and she'll be able to help you figure that out. So I believe we're going to share the contact information for these programs with you, and feel free to reach out to us or to suggest these programs to anyone who you think could benefit from talking through their environmental issue, just to gain another perspective on their options. So thanks for listening and for joining this webinar, and that's all from me.
Thank you so much, Sunshine, for all of your work this summer and for the presentation during your vacation, no less. We appreciate the vacation from your vacation to join us and to share. Time flies. We're already at 1:17 on my clock, which gives us about 13 more minutes here. I will invite you all to put any questions you might have for the panelists in the chat or in the Q&A. I see a couple in there. And while let's give you a moment to do that. I'll just mention that one of the things that you will also receive for registering is a list of resources that we've compiled. And in particular, I just want to mention one of those resources, which is the JEMEZ principles, J-E-M-E-Z. This came out of environmental justice organizing over the last 10, 20, 30 years even, that this conversation has been happening before it really kind of broke into the mainstream. And so the JEMEZ principles are there, they're short, and I really encourage you, even outside of an environmental context, are very good in terms of how to engage ethically with communities that maybe are not your own, and with whom there may be power dynamics and so on, to move out of, the type of kind of savior complex or even extractive, in terms of storytelling and so on. Those dynamics can still show up even with the best intentions. And so just encourage you to take a look at those and incorporate those into your daily practices, whatever you may be doing. So just gonna quickly check here for some of these questions. So I have one here that asks if there's a similar environmental dispute fund for people in Alberta. I don't know the answer to that. I'm not sure if anyone else does. I know that Eco-Justice has an office in Calgary, although they, I think, it focus on systemic cases. So I'm not sure if there's an exact parallel. If anyone else is aware, please put it in the chat. Okay, so we've got another question here. Sea level rise impacts disproportionately coastal Indigenous communities. Is there a resource to mitigate that impact in the federal and provincial level? That's a great question, and I think it's something that's already been experienced in many coastal communities. Not just sea level rise, ocean acidification, all these things. And so maybe, I'm not sure if Chief Slett, if you have any thoughts on, what you think, maybe go beyond resources and just maybe what types of changes do you think could happen in the federal and provincial levels to address these disproportionate impacts?
Well, for us, we always look inwards and look at our laws that we have, within our community, and the recognition of our laws and how they have sustained us. So we've worked on, our own investigation following the Nathan E. Stewart, because Canada and the BC would not include us, in that investigation. We also took a look at, looking at the impacts of the oil spill and the grounding, and what laws were violated, what Heiltsuk laws were violated. So we did up an adjudication report, based on that. So we always look inwards, but definitely looking at things like funding for infrastructure changes, would be needed. There is so many things that are happening, within government in terms of legislative changes and reforms and projects that, affect our communities. And it's really hard to be able to, have a seat at the table or even provide input, without some support. We're a coastal rural community, but we have, a lot of, we have a lot of concerns, and, we want to make sure that, our voices are heard at, all levels.
Thank you. Any other panelists want to address this small question? Okay, I'm going to move on to another question here. And just noting that we're running a little low on time. So if you do have any questions, please pop them in the chat or the Q&A. Oh, it looks like we've got another one in the Q&A. Thanks, Angela. Let's see. All right, here's a question from Lori Stott. I teach students who will be working in the environmental field and supporting them in both their field studies and research, as well as guide them through an environmental law course. How best to support them and educate them so they are aware of the environmental racism and these issues of Indigenous and BIPOC communities in BC? Anyone want to take a crack at that? I've got some thoughts. Sure. Okay, I'll start and see. So yeah, I mean, I think there, as we kind of tried to address at the start, I think it's understanding that racism and white supremacy on a systemic level impacts everything, including environmental issues. And we've given some examples, and I think it's it's one of those things. It's like an onion, right? Like once you start peeling off a layer, it just keeps going and going, and then before you know it, you're crying because once you see, once you understand the disproportionate impacts, and then you start to see it. I was lucky to take a bit of a road trip last week for my vacation, and and you're driving along the highway, you can see the reserves and then the waste sites. It's not hidden even. And thinking about questions like if the Athabasca River flowed the other way, so that the tar sands were downstream, or the Edmonton was downstream of the tar sands rather than Indigenous communities being downstream, how might that development have gone differently? There's lots of questions and examples that we can point to, both locally and regionally, but also nationally and internationally. And I think it's really helpful to and important and critical to look at that and to understand for any of this work to be successful. And then the last thing I'll say is something I touched on earlier, which is even our concept of what environmentalism is and means needs a critical lens. And it's important to think about, a lot of, for example, a lot of folks, talk about parks as a great way of preserving and conserving the natural world, which it is, and also allowing people to enjoy it. But at the same time, the history of many national parks and provincial parks and regional parks in Canada and in the US is one of displacement of Indigenous peoples, of limiting rights in those spaces. And so I think there is, I think it's bringing a critical lens to all of this. And I think Rihanna's approach that she talked about, that we're all engaged in, of looking at these things through an intersectional lens, is critical, and that's why I think this moment is actually really, there are glimmers of hope where these conversations, which are challenging, but at least there are spaces and there's openness now for some of those conversations and uncomfortable conversations to happen. And I think part of there's no growth that happened without some level of discomfort. I have another, yeah, go ahead.
One really quick thing to add to Lori's question is echoing what Rihanna said about Instagram. It's a really great resource, especially for students if they're young people. I find that it's really accessible to be able to, just the format is accessible. Usually they're short videos or short posts, and the content is really usually personal. So if you're sharing and uplifting like BIPOC voices, melanated voices, that's a really great educational tool.
I just echo what Sunshine's saying is just if there's an opportunity, whether video or live, to have voices, Indigenous voices, Black voices, racialized voices, very powerful. And also it's giving space so that BIPOC have the opportunity to have their voices. Because that's important too, that we tell our own stories. We do appreciate allies, but we need the opportunity to tell our stories as well.
Thank you. So we're almost out of time. I want to end on hopefully a positive note. I want to ask to the panel, what is giving you hope in this moment, in this time? And while we're doing that, I think Alexis is going to screen share the word cloud from some of your own chats. So you see that there, and I'll just invite, maybe I'll start with just randomly, I'm going to pick Rihanna. Can you start us off with what gives you hope these days?
So what gives me hope? Well, that is such a loaded question, but I guess what maybe keeps me going is recognizing that it only took like 150 years to get to this point of where this pollution and where Mother Earth is suffering so bad. So it's possible to get to where it was within another 150 years. So that hope of like continuing on with my with my relationship with land and water, but also recognizing that we are able to get back to where we once were not so long ago. I'll pass it on to Sunshine.
Okay, I would say that I'm really hopeful about Gen Z and their use of like creatively using technology for activism and educating people through TikTok and Instagram and protesting through Twitter. It's really incredible, and I'm really impressed. I'll pass it on to Lorene.
Unmute myself. I'm hopeful. I'm gonna have to brag about it, being with West Coast Environmental Law, knowing there's other organizations, but also just the really true meaning of inclusivity, of working with Indigenous, working with Black, working with racialized communities. There's hope in each little thing, each big thing. All of it makes a difference. Gives me hope. Thank you.
Thank you.
And pass it on to Chief Marilyn.
It gives me hope. We always have hope. We wouldn't be here without it. I shared at the beginning of the presentation, what grounds me and what helps me to stay focused. And I think what gives me hope is we're standing on the shoulders of great leaders, from our communities. All of our communities have them, and we're standing on those shoulders and knowing that, we're grounded in our, in who we're supposed to be and where we're supposed to be, and giving hope for today and hope for tomorrow, and never give up. We're strong people, we're resilient people, and we have, a great future. and we can, do that together. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you all for sticking with us a minute over. That's pretty good for me to only be a minute late. I really want to appreciate you all for joining. We had over 300 people register. I know not everyone was able to join, but just want to reiterate that the recording will be available afterwards. I want to thank all of the panelists for sharing their words and wisdom. Also want to thank the West Coast team, and in particular Angela Fan and Alexis Stoimanov for a lot of the support in the back end, as well as Julia. And then I saw Lisa on there too. Hey Lisa, thank you. And to all of our donors and supporters for helping to fund this work, without which this would not be possible. Just so you know, we are looking into doing more webinars that are gonna look at different aspects of environmental justice, environmental racism. And so we will be sending a survey to follow up along with the link of the recording to get a sense of what you're interested in and feedback from today. And again, if you are in need of legal support related to environmental issue, please check out our website. You can sign up to our newsletter, which will give you updates and invites for future webinars. I think someone's going to throw that in the chat. And you can support us by donating, of course, at wcel.org/donate. And follow us on all the platforms at WCE Law, although I don't think we're on TikTok yet. We're gonna work on our dance moves, I think. But at this point, I think I'm just gonna close us off and thank you again all for joining and for your beautiful words. And we look forward to seeing you in the near future. Bye.
Bye.